Death is not the end of experience, it cannot be. Quantum mechanics proves you will never experience dying, not because you survive death in some afterlife, but because death is the cessation of experience and you cannot experience cessation. Every moment you're conscious must be a moment you're alive. Death happens only in branches you never experience. From your subjective perspective, death is impossible, and the physics proves it. Let me show you why quantum mechanics guarantees you can never experience your own death, and what that terrifying truth means for existence. The argument starts with a simple observation: consciousness requires being alive. Dead organisms have no conscious experience. Death is the end of consciousness, the cessation of subjective experience. You cannot be conscious of being dead because being dead means not being conscious. Therefore, you cannot experience your own death. You can experience being alive. You cannot experience being dead. The transition between them is not experienceable. This seems obvious, but combine it with quantum mechanics and something profound emerges. In the many worlds interpretation, every quantum event causes the universe to split into branches. In some branches, one outcome occurs. In other branches, different outcomes occur. All branches are real. All outcomes happen. You exist in multiple branches simultaneously, experiencing different versions of events. Now consider a situation where you might die. A quantum event determines whether you survive or die. In standard many worlds, both outcomes occur. In some branches, you survive. In other branches, you die. Both versions of you are real. But here's the crucial asymmetry. The surviving versions continue having conscious experiences. The dying versions cease having conscious experiences. Your consciousness can only continue in branches where you survived. The branches where you died contain no further conscious experiences of you. Your subjective stream of consciousness necessarily follows only the surviving branches. Not because those branches are special, not because you're lucky, but because consciousness can only exist in branches where you're alive. This is the quantum immortality argument. From the third-person objective perspective, you die in many branches. From the first-person subjective perspective, you only experience branches where you survived. You always find yourself alive because being alive is a prerequisite for finding yourself anywhere. Let me make this more precise. Consider a specific quantum event at time t that determines your survival. Before t, you exist in a superposition. The quantum state includes amplitude for both survival and death. At t, the universe branches. In survival branches, consciousness continues. In death branches, consciousness ends. Your subjective experience at time t+1 can only occur in survival branches because experience requires consciousness requires being alive. This pattern repeats at every moment. At every quantum event where death is possible, branches split. You die in some branches. You survive in others. Your consciousness always finds itself in surviving branches. Not because death branches are eliminated. They exist. They're real, but they contain no you experiencing them because you're dead in those branches. The philosophical term for this is observer selection. You can only observe outcomes in which an observer exists. Dead branches contain no observer to experience the death. Living branches contain an observer to experience survival. So you necessarily observe survival, not because survival is more probable, but because observation requires an observer. Now let me explain why this is not comforting. Quantum immortality doesn't mean you're invincible or that you live forever young and healthy. It means you continue experiencing in whatever branches allow experience to continue. As you age, as your body deteriorates, death becomes probable in most branches. You die in the vast majority of branches, but you still only experience the remaining branches where survival occurred. What does survival look like when you're 99 years old with organ failure? In most branches you die, but some branches must exist where your heart keeps beating, your brain keeps functioning. You survive another moment. These branches become increasingly improbable, but probability doesn't matter for subjective experience. You experience whatever branches contain experience. Improbable branches still contain experience. This leads to the quantum immortality horror. You might survive into increasingly unlikely and unpleasant states. Severe cognitive impairment, but consciousness persists. Permanent vegetative state with minimal awareness. Extreme old age with constant suffering. You keep experiencing because experience only occurs in branches where you're alive, regardless of quality. The question becomes, is there a lower bound to consciousness? Can consciousness exist at arbitrarily low levels of brain function? If consciousness requires certain minimal neural activity, then when that threshold is crossed in all branches, experience finally ends. But if consciousness can persist at any level, however minimal, quantum immortality might continue indefinitely. We don't know the answer. We don't have a theory of consciousness precise enough to specify minimal requirements. But quantum immortality logic suggests your experience continues in whatever branches allow any experience, no matter how degraded. This is not eternal youth. This is potentially eternal decline. Now let me address whether this is actually true or just an artifact of interpretation. Quantum immortality requires many worlds to be correct. If wave function collapse is real and objective, if only one branch becomes actual while others don't happen, then quantum immortality fails. In collapse interpretations, you can die. The one real branch might be the death branch. I think collapse is real. I think objective reduction occurs when gravitational effects make quantum superpositions unstable. This means most branches don't happen. Only one branch becomes actual at each collapse event. So quantum immortality as described doesn't hold in my view. Eventually you face a situation where collapse selects death in the one real branch. Your experience ends, death occurs. But even with objective collapse, something similar to quantum immortality operates temporarily. Before collapse, your brain exists in quantum superposition of different states. Some states lead to survival, others lead to death. These superpositions might persist for brief periods before gravitational effects force collapse. During that time, you're genuinely in superposition of life and death. Not metaphorically, physically. Your consciousness exists in superposition of experiencing survival and experiencing death. When collapse occurs, one outcome becomes real. If it's survival, your consciousness continues. If it's death, consciousness ends. But before collapse, both existed in superposition. This means even without many worlds, your consciousness involves superpositions of survival and death that collapse to one or the other. You only continue experiencing when collapse selects survival. So subjectively, you experience surviving close calls because when collapse selects death, experience ends, and there's no subsequent experience of death. This is a weaker form of quantum immortality, not eternal because eventually all possible collapses lead to death, but operative until that final moment. You experience surviving close calls until you don't survive, but you never experience not surviving because when that happens, experience stops. Let me connect this to the structure of time and the block universe. Einstein showed that past, present, and future exist in four-dimensional space-time. Your world line from birth to death exists eternally at its proper coordinates. When your world line ends at death, no conscious experience of you exists at later temporal coordinates. Your subjective time terminates. But you never experience the termination. You experience being alive up to the endpoint. Then experience stops. There's no experience of the stopping, no moment where you're conscious of being dead. Just cessation of experience. Death is the boundary of your experiential domain. You approach it, you never cross it from inside. This makes death both real and unexperienceable. Real because it happens objectively in the block universe. Unexperienceable because experiencing requires consciousness, requires being alive. The boundary of consciousness is the boundary of life. Beyond that, experience doesn't extend. Not because there's something preventing it, but because experience is what life is, and death is its cessation. Now let me address the deeper implications. If you can never experience death, what can you know about it? Nothing directly. Everything about death comes from third-person observation. You see others die, you infer you'll die, but you cannot verify this from first-person experience. Your death is the one fact about yourself you can never confirm experimentally. This creates a strange epistemic situation. You know you will die. Evidence from biology, observation of others, statistical certainty, but you also know you'll never experience dying. Your death is certain from third-person perspective, but impossible from first-person perspective. Both are true. The tension between them is permanent. Some people find quantum immortality comforting. They interpret it as meaning death is illusory, that consciousness must continue somehow. But this is misunderstanding. Death is real. Consciousness ends, just not experienceably from inside. Your world line terminates. Your pattern dissolves. The quantum field configurations that were you disperse. Death happens. You just can't experience it happening. Others find quantum immortality horrifying. If many worlds is correct, you're condemned to experience increasingly improbable survival states as probability narrows. You might experience extreme age, severe disability, minimal consciousness persisting in degraded states. The probability of this is low from third-person view, But from first-person view, you necessarily experience whatever branches allow experience. I think both reactions miss the point. Quantum immortality, whether many worlds or weak collapse version, is not about whether you want death to be real or illusory. It's about the structure of consciousness and experience. Consciousness is first-person subjective. Death is third-person objective. The two domains don't intersect. What's real for one is impossible for the other. Let me make this more precise using the language of quantum mechanics. Your brain state at any time is a quantum state, a superposition of possible configurations. Some configurations lead to continued function. Others lead to failure and death. As long as the superposition includes amplitude for functional states, consciousness can continue. When all amplitude is in non-functional states, consciousness ends. In many worlds, the superposition never fully collapses. Different branches have different outcomes. Your consciousness continues in branches with amplitude for functional states. In objective reduction, the superposition collapses when gravitational effects dominate. Only one outcome becomes real. If it's a functional state, consciousness continues. If not, consciousness ends. Either way, your subjective experience tracks functional states. You can only experience moments where your brain is functioning because experience requires functioning brain. Non-functional states contain no experience to observe them. So you necessarily find yourself in functional states whenever you find yourself at all. This is not special physics. This is just observer selection. You can only be conscious at times and in states where consciousness is possible. This is trivially true but has profound implications when combined with quantum branching or quantum collapse. You always experience being alive because being dead excludes experiencing. Now let me connect this to what happens at the moment of death. In many worlds, the moment when you die in some branches is also the moment when you survive in other branches. Your consciousness doesn't experience the dying branches. It continues in surviving branches. From your perspective, you survived. You remember the danger, the close call, the relief of survival. The dying version of you has no perspective to remember anything. In objective reduction, the moment of death is when collapse selects a non-functional state. Before collapse, superposition included functional states. Your consciousness existed in superposition. When collapse occurs to non-functional state, consciousness ends. But there's no experience of the collapse. Experience was in the superposition. After collapse to death, no experience. This means the last moment of consciousness is the last moment of superposition, including functional states. You experience that moment, then collapse occurs. If to survival, you experience the next moment. If to death, you don't experience anything further. The last conscious moment is always one where you're alive because consciousness requires being alive. So death experientially is not a moment you live through. It's the termination of moments you live through. The last moment is conscious. After that, no moments, not darkness, not void, not experience of nothing. Just no experience. Experiential time stops. Not experienced as stopping. Just stopping. Let me address whether you should fear death given this understanding. Fear is appropriate response to harm, pain, loss. Death involves loss of all future experiences. That's rationally fearsome if you value experience, but fearing the moment of death itself might be misplaced. There is no moment of death to experience, only moments before death, which are living moments. You might fear the process of dying, the physical deterioration, potential pain and suffering. Those are experiences you might have while alive. Fearing them is rational. But fearing death itself, the state of being dead, might be incoherent. There's no state of being dead you experience. Being dead is not a state you're in. It's the absence of states you're in. Some philosophers argue death is bad because it deprives you of future goods. This doesn't require experiencing death. The badness is the loss of what you would have experienced had you lived. This is third-person badness. From your first-person perspective at any moment, you're experiencing. The deprivation isn't experienceable because when deprivation occurs, there's no you to experience it. This doesn't mean death isn't bad. It means the badness is structural, not experiential. Death is bad because your world line terminates, your pattern dissolves, your potential future experiences don't occur. But the badness isn't something you undergo. It's something that happens to the structure of your existence from outside temporal perspective. Now let me connect this to consciousness and quantum mechanics more fundamentally. I've argued consciousness involves quantum processes in the brain, specifically orchestrated objective reduction in microtubules. When quantum superpositions in microtubules collapse, conscious moments occur. Consciousness is the subjective experience of quantum collapse in organized biological structures. If this is correct, then every conscious moment involves quantum processes that could lead to different outcomes. Brain function continues or fails based on quantum events. The quantum state includes amplitude for both. When collapse occurs, one becomes actual. Consciousness continues if collapse selects functional outcome. Consciousness ends if collapse selects failure. This means every conscious moment is a moment you survived quantum collapse to functional state. The alternative, collapse to failure leading to cessation, is not experienceable because no consciousness results. So you necessarily experience only collapses that preserve function. Death is the final collapse that doesn't. This makes consciousness inherently survival biased. You can only be conscious at moments when brain functions survived to that moment. Past failures eliminated those branches or collapsed them away. You're always in the subset of possibilities where survival occurred up to now, not because you're special, because consciousness requires functional brain requires survival. Let me now address the practical implications. Should you take risks because you're quantum immortal from first-person view? No, this reasoning is catastrophically wrong. From third-person view, taking risks increases probability of death. In many worlds, you die in more branches. In objective reduction, you increase probability collapse selects death. The surviving version experiences survival, but that doesn't make the dying versions less real. If many worlds is correct, they're as real as surviving version. You shouldn't want to die in most branches just because one branch survives. If objective reduction is correct, you probably die if you take great risks. The survival experience doesn't make death improbable. Moreover, survival might not be clean. You might survive the accident with severe brain damage. You might survive the disease with permanent disability. The branches you experience might be ones where you wish you'd been more careful. Quantum immortality doesn't guarantee good survival, just some survival, so you should avoid risks for the same reasons you always have. Death in most branches is bad if many worlds is true. Death in the one branch is bad if collapse is true. The fact that you can't experience your own death doesn't make death less bad. It makes the badness structural rather than experiential. Let me address the relationship between this and the hard problem of consciousness. Why is there subjective experience at all? Why doesn't information processing occur in darkness with no one experiencing? The hard problem asks why consciousness exists. Quantum immortality adds another question. Given that consciousness exists, why does it necessarily track living states? Because consciousness requires functional brain. But why? Why couldn't there be consciousness without biological function? Why is consciousness confined to living systems? The answer might be that consciousness is what quantum collapse feels like from inside when it occurs in organized structures. Living systems maintain the organization through metabolism. Death is the breakdown of organization. When organization fails, collapse events become chaotic, lose coordination, cease to produce unified conscious moments. Consciousness requires the organization that life maintains. This makes consciousness not just correlated with life but dependent on it in principle, not contingently, as if consciousness could exist without life but happens not to. Necessarily, because consciousness is organized collapse and life is what maintains organization. When life ends, organization fails, consciousness ceases. This explains why you can't experience death. Death is not a state consciousness can be in. Death is the destruction of conditions consciousness requires. You can't be conscious of conditions that exclude consciousness. Death excludes consciousness. Therefore, you can't be conscious of being dead. Let me end with the most profound implication. Death is impossible to experience, not because death doesn't happen. Death happens. Your world line ends. Your pattern dissolves. Your consciousness ceases. All of this is real and objective, but from your subjective first-person perspective, death never comes. You experience being alive up to the last moment, then experience stops. No experience of stopping, just stopping. This makes your entire life, from birth to death, a sequence of conscious moments where you're alive. You never experience being dead because you can't. The boundary of your experience is the boundary of your life. You approach it, you reach it, you never cross it from inside because crossing requires being on the other side, which is death, which excludes experience. Death is impossible according to quantum physics. Not objectively. Objectively, death is certain. Subjectively, death is impossible. Both are true. The objective and subjective domains are different. What's certain in one is impossible in the other. You will die. You will never experience dying. Both are facts. Both are proven by physics. That's why death is impossible from your perspective and certain from outside perspective. That's why quantum mechanics proves you can't experience your own death while also confirming death happens. That's the truth about consciousness, death, and the structure of experience. You can't die, you will die. Both are true. And that's what quantum physics tells us about the relationship between consciousness and mortality. Death is the boundary of experience. You live up to it. You never passed it. From inside, death never comes. From outside, death comes to all. Quantum mechanics proves death is impossible to experience while guaranteeing death occurs. That's the paradox of consciousness in a quantum universe. And that's why you can't die from your own perspective even though you certainly will die from everyone else's.